evening. It is lovely to see all of you. I always enjoy coming up this way. I've had the honor of coming and preaching here on multiple occasions, and for some reason, every time I come up here, I seem to gravitate towards the Gospel of Mark. So I don't know if you remember, because I barely remember, but I think I've done 3 or 4 sermons from the Gospel of Mark. There are other books in the Bible, I just haven't ventured out to them yet. Amen. I am going to utilize this stool. It's a little smoky. I got a cold a couple weeks ago, and I've just had this lingering cough. I think it's just exasperated by the smoke. It's a nasty thing. But such is British Columbia in the summertime after no rain. So we're going to be turning to the Gospel of Mark, and if I have nothing intelligent to say, at least I have a fun title. My title this evening is When Pigs Fly. When Pigs Fly. Oh, there. That's beautiful. Thank you. I'm going to have to hire those boys to be my digital creators for Lifetree. It's good stuff. I don't hear the phrase very often now, when pigs fly, but growing up, it was one of those sarcastic remarks when, you made a commitment. Oh, Mom, I'll clean my room. Yeah, when pigs fly. It's, oh, don't worry, I'm going to pay you back that money I owe you. And you're like, yeah, when pigs fly. It's that idiom that highlights something that is completely impossible or will never happen, I'll fold my laundry tonight. Yeah, okay. When pigs fly. And it is that highly improbable situation that I want to highlight to us today, when pigs fly. And we are going to turn to the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 5 will be my reading passage, and I'm just going to give us a bit of background first. And an instance where pigs, in fact, did fly. Sometimes we want to teach from the popular verses, the popular stories. They're easy, they connect with people, and they're not so weird. This is a weird story, and we're going to dive into it. And I'm not 100% convinced that I have the definitive reading of this text, but I think there is something we can glean from it, and I'm just going to bring into a little bit of insight of what might be happening in this passage, and talk about the God who does the impossible. And so much of our walk with Christ is a pilgrimage, it's a journey, and we spend more time waiting than receiving. It's like Christmas. You have that anticipation and that buildup. As a kid, you're waiting for Christmas. And in 10 minutes, you've opened all the presents and wondered, is that all? But anyways, maybe that was me. I was spoiled. But there's a lot of waiting and anticipation. And then it arrives and it's like, wow, Christmas just happened. It's over. We're into Boxing Day, New Year. Oh, great. I got to lose weight now. All these things happen so fast, except for weight loss. But we spend our time, sometimes it feels like, waiting on the wings, waiting in the margins. And that is the Christian life, is that waiting, but waiting in hope. We don't wait with doubt and fear. We wait in hope. So, leading up to Mark chapter 5, Jesus had just told a bunch of parables, and he talks about, the different types of soil and the seed that goes in, and certain parts of the field receive the word, some do not, some understand, and some do, some don't. And ironically, Jesus tells his disciples and explains the parable to them because they're supposed to understand it. And ironically, in the Gospel of Mark, there's this dramatic reversal where, the disciples are kind of the foil of the plot. They're not understanding. Everyone around Jesus is like, wow, this is the Messiah, this is that, and the disciples are kind of clueless. It's almost ironic. And so Jesus finishes teaching in Mark chapter 4. The evening comes, and Jesus says, let us go across to the other side. And they go across the Sea of Galilee, and they go into this area, this region called the Gerasenes, which is, it's on the other side of Galilee. It's not Jewish communities. They are Gentile. They're probably Greek speaking, and they're maybe a bit of Aramaic spattered in there, but mostly they are non-Jewish communities on the other side. And Jesus primarily ministered to his own people. Um, but as they're crossing and they're on this boat, a massive windstorm comes up, and it begins to the waves start to beat against the boat and into the boat, and the boat is starting to get full of water, and Jesus is passed out on a cushion somewhere, and they wake him up, and they're like, teacher, don't you care? Teacher. They're acknowledging that he's their teacher. So they have this understanding. They have received Jesus as their teacher. And they're like, do you not care that we're dying out here? Like, that our very lives are threatened. And Jesus kind of like, wakes himself up, and he rebukes the wind, and he says to the sea, be silent, be still. And the wind stops, and the sea is a dead calm. And he turns to his disciples like, hey, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? Do you still not understand? And they were filled with great fear or great wonder. And they said, the disciples, one to another, who is this guy? Right? They don't know. And so us as readers, we kind of get the inside track, and we're like, we know who Jesus is. And we watch and see the disciples they're not really getting it, and people aren't really understanding it. And immediately after this question, who is this then that even the wind and the sea obey him, it brings us to our reading today in Mark chapter 5, verses 1. And that's where I'm going to start reading. And I'm going to read the whole pericope, the whole story, from 1 through 13, and then we'll talk about it for a bit. All right, so they came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. Tells us a little about the guy. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. They tried chaining this guy up. He was so out of it. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke to pieces. And no one had the strength to subdue him. And so you have this picture of this guy who is completely out of his mind, living among the tombs. He's literally breaking the restraints that they're trying to tie him down and hold him back with, and no one has the power, the strength, no one has the authority to deal with this man and his issues. And it's like this, there's this immediate confrontation. It's like Jesus gets off the boat, and here comes the village crazy guy straight for him. Right? What's going to happen? And it says, night and day among the tombs on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. He's in rough shape. But it says, when he saw Jesus from a distance, Jesus is still a far way off, he ran and bowed before him. On the heels of this, Jesus just calmed the storm, and the disciples are like, wow, who is this guy that even wind and waves, the very elements, are obedient to him? And then this man runs and bows before Jesus, and he shouted at the top of his voice, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Right? The disciples are like, who is this guy? And this crazy man's like, I know exactly who you are. The Spirit cries out and says, the Son of the Most High God. I adjure you by God, do not torment me. For he had said to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. Then Jesus asked him, what is your name? And he replied, my name is Legion. That's eerie. For we are many. That's really creepy. He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the region. The spirits are begging not to send out of the region. Now, on the hillside, a great herd of swine, that's pigs, were feeding. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out, entered the swine, and the herd numbered about 2,000. That's a really big herd. 2,000. And stamped down the steep bank into the sea, over the cliff, pigs fly. That's the title tie-in. It's a bit of a stretch, but it was a funny title, so I went with it anyways. I never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. Stamped down into the sea and were drowned in the sea. That's a weird story. To me, that's a weird story. Okay? What is going on here? You know, there's instances in the New Testament, in the life of Jesus, where he exhibits unique authority over sickness, disease. But in the ancient world, they didn't separate stuff sometimes like we do. We think of, oh, if it's spiritual, it's not physical. If it's physical, it's not spiritual. And I think that in the ancient mind, you're sick. You might have a spirit or you might have a disease, but you're sick. It was kind of more all tied together. Um, so it's just so funny to me that the disciples are like, "Who is this guy?" And Jesus had to explain to them the parables because they're not understanding the parables. He's like, "You're the ones that are supposed to understand this." And here, this man filled with spirits, evil spirits, recognizes, and even though these, you know, numbering about 2,000 spirits that filled these pigs were in, you know, setting up shop inside this guy, and that was not able to stop this man from bowing before Jesus and recognizing his authority, right? And it was like the man bows before Jesus, and then the negotiation starts because the spirits know they are at his whim, that they're subject to him. The most impossible situations. Oh, that will never happen. Oh, pigs fly when that person turns their life over to Christ. My grandfather passed away quite some time, many years ago, and we had been praying for him for years and years and years. And he was bitter, he was hurt. Um, he struggled with substance abuse for many, many years, and while he had given that up for quite some time successfully, I think he still carried the guilt, and and it was complicated. But I don't think I don't think he thought that God could forgive him. And 2 weeks before he passes, he's on his deathbed. He's full of, literally riddled with bone cancer. And we baptized him in a hospital tub in the beautiful name of Jesus. And I remember as a kid, it was like we were waging a spiritual war for this man's life. And it was just, he was that person that was like, yeah, his shadow will cast itself over the doors of the church when pigs fly. You know, it was just an impossible, seeming impossible situation. And I'm here to encourage you today because I think we all have our own impossible situations, and that Jesus is the one who makes the impossible possible. And we spend years waiting, we spend years praying, but we spend our years waiting and praying in hope, knowing that God is able to heal, God is able to restore. So, getting into the weeds a little bit in the Gospel of Mark, there's some framework here that I think helps maybe inform, because it's a bizarre passage. Like, why are they filling pigs? Why is there 2,000 of them? Why is it named Legion? So, Mark begins his gospel and he says, the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And what Mark is doing, the Gospel of Mark is running a parallel narrative. It's a story that runs parallel with the story of Caesar, because Caesar, the emperor over the empire, over the Roman world, conquered the Mediterranean. He was called the Son of a God. And when he conquered, it was proclaimed as good news, and an era of peace and security and prosperity. But it was not. It was for some, but for the many, it was not. And so Mark comes in with his account of the life and death, resurrection of Jesus, and says, the good news, not of Caesar, of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And that's the beginning of Mark. At the end of Mark, Jesus is hanging on a cross, and he breathes his last, and he cries out. And then the temple, the Jerusalem temple, this big, thick, woven curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the complex, that veil is torn in two. And it is a Roman centurion who stands and looks at Jesus, and the way that he died, it says, and as he facing him, he saw that in this way he breathed his last. The Roman centurion says, truly, this man is God's son. And so there is this parallel narrative of the narrative of Caesar and the narrative of Jesus Christ. Caesar is a phony. Caesar is a copy, a broken copy of what God truly is. And so, framed in this way, you have this kind of parallel narrative. And I think that there is an intersection here with this story of these spirits called Legion that inhabit pigs and go flying off a cliff. You know, the demoniac, this guy was the village crazy. If someone were to say, oh, yeah, he'll come around to himself, just give him a couple years. There's that one cynical guy in the crowd who's like, yeah, when pigs fly. But indeed, the pigs did fly. But what is spirit possession or oppression? It's a weird topic, I think, especially to our modern sensibilities, right? If we can't see it under the microscope, it doesn't exist. And I'm not going to pretend I have the inside track on what evil spirits, what demons are, and how they work in the world and how they manifest themselves. I don't pretend to understand that. You know, demonic stuff, that stuff's really weird, but you know what's really weird are the people that are obsessed with that stuff. They can be a little weird too. But I think there's a reality that Scripture points to that often in our modern sensibility we sweep aside, we neglect, and we don't take seriously. There was the mute man. So in Matthew, Jesus drives out of a demon out of a man who couldn't speak, and then he begins to talk normally. So in this situation, the spirit is affecting his ability to talk. And it's not always that sickness was categorized as spirit. Sometimes it was separate. Jesus healed people who are ill with diseases, suffering severe pain, or demon possessed, or having seizures, paralyzed, and he healed all of them. And exactly, all kinds, all manner of diseases and spirits. And while sometimes there seems to be an overlap, other times it seems to be separate. And Jesus, I mean, sometimes he touched, sometimes he spoke words of healing. For demonic possession, he directly addressed, he rebuked and commanded these spiritual entities to leave the person. But the key takeaway, I think, is that Jesus had the authority over all illness, disease, and oppression, regardless of how it manifested. And another thing to point out is that in scripture and in my observation, that people who are oppressed by spirits were often victims rather than perpetrators. They were victims. There was the child that was possessed with a spirit in the gospel accounts. What did the child do? Probably nothing. And actually, in people I trust who have encountered bizarre situations like this, even my brother, and it was there were children that were really oppressed by spirits, and so victims, not perpetrators necessarily. But Ephesians chapter 6 and 10 says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and the power of his strength. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For our struggle is not against blood and flesh, but against rulers, against authorities, and against cosmic powers of this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places." You see, in the biblical times, they understood the universe, the cosmos, as a hierarchy of beings. And there were spiritual beings, powers of the air, that were above humans, right? When it talks about Jesus coming down, made him slightly lower than the angels, right? And angels can be a generic term for spirits or messengers, and so they kind of had these layers of beings and powers. And even God in Psalms, he consults the divine counsel of these divine angelic beings to take counsel of how to proceed. The book of Job, with there's this divine court, and the accuser comes forward, and so they had this understanding of beings and principalities that were cosmic. They're part of the universe, and Paul would condemn idolatry as the idols of demons, and that there were spirits attached to those things, and that they were in the guise of gods, but they were not gods. They were evil, corrupted beings that were bent on destruction and evil, beings that had been corrupted and were bent on seeing God's good creation torn apart. They're agents of chaos and destruction, and that's all they fester and feed on. Yet when Jesus breathed his last and he died, the veil was torn. And while the veil talk, you can think about that as, access to God's presence and the Spirit of God, where the access to the Holy of Holies, that barrier had been torn. But the temple veil at that time was described by Josephus as having all the stars of the constellations on it, and that the veil that covered the Holy of Holies was a picture of the cosmos, of the stars, and that God from the temple would rule the universe, rule the cosmos, and that when the veil was torn, it's like this event, the death of Jesus was not just the death of another man, but it was this cosmic tearing event that shook the very fibers of reality, that all powers and principalities were subject to him. And death, even death itself, was conquered in the resurrection. And so when Mark is talking about the gospel of Jesus, and there's this kind of parallel narrative of the gospel of Caesar, that it's not just Caesar. It's not just one evil man with an evil army, with evil rulers. There's cosmic powers behind the powers, right? The forces of empire would conquer, they would abuse, they would enslave, they would terrorize regions. They would enslave by the thousands. They were horrific to the people of Palestine, the Jews, the non-Jews, people in that region. It was really the elite of the elite, the one percenters that were benefiting, but everyone else carried the burden of that. And so how does this tie into this story of this demonic possession? Well, I think this parallel narrative with Caesar, I think it intersects here, and it's not something we catch readily with our eye, but the Roman armies were divided into legions. That's what they were called. And the man says, "We are legion." There was many of us. Roman legions would range from like 2 to 5,000 soldiers. And here we have 2,000 spirits inhabiting pigs. And it's almost like Mark is showing, yes, there's a man here that is oppressed. But that region, they were oppressed by the Roman Empire. And I have noticed that when I've talked to people who have dealt with spiritual oppression, and I'm venturing out into gray area that I don't claim to understand, and I'm not going to pretend I've solved the riddle of it all, but I have noticed that in communities and in countries that have been left destitute, oppressed by colonial powers, that have, and I always thought it was, oh, it's their traditional beliefs that have led them into spiritual possession. And there might be, that might, I don't claim to have the answers, but I have noticed that oppressed communities have different kind of spiritual afflictions that I've noticed that more developed countries, it's less obvious, less aware. And it was an interesting thing to me to think that, could this man's oppression at an individual level be the result of systematic oppression of the principalities and powers of and behind the Roman Empire? Um, and even when I think of our communities here across the island, oppressed peoples that are bearing the weight of trauma, of abuse from generation to generation, and are even kids who don't know the world that their parents lived in are bearing the scars of intergenerational trauma that stemmed from colonial abuses and systematic oppression. Yeah. Mm. Yes. Hmm. And we don't really get names. Well, he's saying the spirits are saying that their name is Legion, right? Hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and it's just it's a weird insight into what people kind of carry in their bodies and how it can manifest. And yeah, the book by Gaber Mate, the body keeps score, right? And how that even intergenerational trauma, and I think they've linked like even substance abuse. You can be addicted to a substance and never had the substance before, but there's actually intergenerational addictions that can occur. And that's why, I mean, it's a weird story. It's a story about like demons filling pigs, and you're like, what's going on here? But as we look into our world and we see the hurt, we see the trauma, but here the story's pointing to a man who proclaimed freedom to these captives, the release of the oppressed and the abused. And the parallels get even more intricate. So you have the name Legion, which represents the Roman military. You have the number, which is 2,000, which is a reasonable number for a Roman legion, right? At the end of the Gospel of Mark is a centurion. The centurion is an officer who would be an officer within the legions. And the other tie-in that makes me think that this might be deliberate is that there's numbers of legions that served the empire. The 10th legion, they would have banners that would represent their army. The 10th Roman legion that occupied Palestine, that was part of the siege on Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple that Jesus foretold, their symbol, one of their symbols, was a pig. It was a wild boar. And so you have a legion, you have 2,000 spirits, and then they go into a pig, into 2,000 pigs, and the pigs cast themselves into the sea. And you almost wonder if there is this kind of like nod towards Jesus's authority, not just over local illness and disease, but that he is the cosmic king over every principality and power and ruler of this age and of any age. It's and so Roman legions could have anywhere from like 2,000, like the numbers varied, but it was usually at least 1,000 people in a Roman legion, and it would fluctuate at times. Yeah, I don't know. It changed. I mean, the Roman Empire lasted a solid 1,000 years, and so it would range. But if you say, okay, there's 11 legions, even if there's a minimal, say, 2,000 per legion, I mean, you could be looking at a standing army of 22,000 upwards of, and that's the legions. That doesn't include the militia and the ancillary armies. You could run into tens of thousands spread out across the empire. Now they don't have numbers like we have numbers today, but back then that was significant. Yes. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting thought because I mean the pigs were, I mean, for starters, the Jewish audience, obviously pigs are unclean and they represent uncleanness and they're buried in the sea, right? Um, and another symbol, though, of the 10th Legion was associated with naval warfare. Neptune, which is the Roman god Neptune, which the Greeks had parallels with Poseidon, right? The god of the sea that controlled the wind and the waves. And that's ironic that Jesus just comes over on the boat and speaks to the wind and the waves and calms the sea, showing that he has the authority over the elemental powers, over the elements and the cosmic powers. And I know I'm kind of pulling at threads here, but it just seems like there's a lot of threads that can be pulled together to say that, oh, it's not, this is not just a story about one man and his suffering, but about Christ's authority over all peoples, over all suffering, over the worst powers of the world. Possession, trauma, and affliction, they all seem to be in relation, and you wonder if this man is bearing in his body the trauma that regions were experiencing under the weight of the Roman Empire. You know, when Jesus is predicting the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in Matthew, I believe it's Mark 14, Matthew, I'm not going to wager, I guess. Um, and he talks about, two people standing in a field working together, and one is taken in death. All of a sudden, they're gone. And then he says, where the eagles, well, vultures, but eagles back then were basically vultures, where the eagles gather, that's where you find the corpses and the bodies piled up. Well, the eagle was the insignia of the Roman army, and Jesus is telling about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and that, keep alert, and when you see the day approaching, run to the hills, because all of a sudden this is going to come down. And at the same time of all this tragedy and the oppression and the hard times of living in that environment, in that era of suffering, of family members being pulled away into slavery, and losing family members, and friends and community members being crucified, when Rome attacked Jerusalem to break the spirits of the soldiers that were still barricaded, they crucified 300 people, Josephus reports, outside the city walls to break their spirits. It was a horrible, horrible time. And Jesus steps on the scene, and Mark says, no, no, this is not the good news of Caesar. Good news of Caesar. This is the good news of Jesus Christ, right? The Son of the Most High God. That's what the spirits called him. Not just the Son of a God, Son of the Most High God. Possession, trauma, and affliction. They all seem to be in relation here. The cosmic powers of evil manifested in kingdoms, empires, and ruling powers that oppress and afflict. They abuse, they exploit. But here in this story, this bizarre story, all these cosmic powers seem to focus around the tormenting of a poor individual soul, an individual life. Yet no power of evil, spirit or otherwise, all the legions, all the power, all the cosmic powers of the universe could not prevent this man from bowing down at the feet of Jesus and acknowledging who he is. And that's the beauty of Scripture. I've studied a lot of history, and they say that, as a history student, I never learn anything new. I only learn about old things. Um, but I don't, as somebody who enjoys history and have studied it to an extent, when I read about Jesus, I don't read about who Jesus was. I read about who Jesus is, who he is in my life, who he is in your family, in your communities, in our frailness, in our brokenness, in our weakness. I learn about who Jesus is. That even the most impossible situation, pigs will fly when that person turns to God. Pigs will fly when they turn their lives around. Well, pigs do fly. The impossible happens. Even in the darkest of times, the most hurting places in our life, we can still pray and wait in hope and in expectation that God can turn around the worst of the worst. I don't I don't understand demonology is the technical word for possession and all the weirdness that's going in this story. And I don't pretend to understand the complexities of trauma and what people suffer and how complex and interconnected it is and how it can affect every facet of our lives. I don't understand. These things are shrouded in mystery for me. But I do believe in Jesus. I do believe that Jesus is still the solution to these problems. That Jesus is still the answer. And you may have a impossible situation in your life that you don't understand, and you may have tried to figure out and make sense of. God, why did you allow this to happen in my life? Why did you allow this to happen? I don't know. There's stuff in my life I still don't have the answer for. But like this man possessed by demons, if I can get my situation in front of Jesus, if I can bring my situation to Jesus, that is enough. It's not about me controlling the situation and me controlling the outcomes. If I can take them and lay them at the foot of the cross, there is always hope. You may be the victim of abuse and trauma. You might be carrying affliction around with you and in your own body. You may be tormented. You might be a victim of systemic violence and injustice. You may carry intergenerational trauma that was never yours to carry. It's never your responsibility to carry the scars of your ancestors. And you may look at your life and these situations as hopeless. But I'm here to tell you about the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. who all powers and principalities are subject to him, that even death itself, the greatest weapons of our world, are violence and death. Even violence and death bow at the feet of Jesus. I'm just here to tell you today, when it comes to Jesus, pigs do in fact fly. And in the remainder of our time here, maybe as I've been talking, maybe a situation has come to your mind. I know even just in my own life, I have a brother, and he is dealing with a lot of mental illness, and things have worsened over the years, and he lives in isolation. And I look at that situation and I say, at times in my own humanity, say, God, I just don't see a way. I don't see hope in this situation. You know, Jesus told one man, if you believe, all things are possible. And the man's like, well, I believe, but help my unbelief. And sometimes in ourselves, those two things can be happening and true at the same time. Lord, I believe, but I have my moments. It's okay to have your moments. And as maybe I've been teaching, there's been a situation that's come to your mind, and I just want us to, in closing, just to bow our heads and pray about these situations, to take them before Jesus.